The Olympic National Forest assignment was supposed to last 3 weeks. I was tracking grey wolf migration patterns through the Ho River Valley, setting camera traps along known corridors between 200 and 800 feet elevation. By mid-September, the rain had stopped long enough for me to establish a base camp near Boulder Creek, roughly 4 miles from the nearest Forest Service road. The permit allowed solo research. I had done this work for 6 years without incident. On September 18th, I checked Trap Site 7, a clearing where deer trails converged near a fallen Douglas fir. The SD card showed standard footage: Roosevelt elk at dawn, a black bear around noon, coyotes after dark. But frame 1847 stood out. At 0412, every animal in frame froze mid-movement. A doe lifted her head, ears forward, staring directly past the camera. For 11 seconds, nothing moved. Then they scattered simultaneously, crashing through underbrush in 3 directions. The timestamp showed another 4 hours of empty forest before normal activity resumed at sunrise. I've seen predator responses before. Mountain lions trigger that kind of panic. But the reaction pattern was wrong. Prey animals flee the threat, not away from multiple exit points at once. This looked like evacuation. That night, back at camp, I heard the first anomaly. Around 22:30, the forest went silent. Not quiet, silent. The creek still ran, but every insect, every bird, every rustle of wind through the canopy just stopped. I've read about this phenomenon in predator studies, but never experienced it lasting more than a minute or two. This held for nearly 20 minutes. I sat inside my tent with the headlamp off, listening to my own pulse. When sound returned, it came back wrong. The creek seemed louder. The wind felt delayed, like it was reaching me a half second after I saw the trees move. I checked my field recorder the next morning. The audio file showed a flat line during those 20 minutes, then a sudden spike. A low-frequency sound, maybe 30-40 hertz, right at the edge of human hearing. It lasted 3 seconds. I ran it through a spectrogram analysis on my laptop. The waveform was clean, rhythmic. Not geological. Not animal. At least nothing I recognized. On the morning of the 20th, I found the first print. It was in soft mud near the creek, about 60 yards downstream from camp. I've documented black bear tracks across 4 states. This wasn't one. The impression was 18 inches long, 7 inches across at the ball, with 5 distinct toe marks. The depth suggested something heavy, maybe 400 pounds, walking bipedally. The stride length, measured between 3 consecutive prints heading west, was 54 inches. I photographed it from 4 angles, placed a ruler in frame, took soil samples. My first thought was hoax, but the print was 800 yards from the nearest trail, in terrain that would take deliberate effort to reach. The mud showed no tool marks, no inconsistencies in pressure distribution. I made a plaster cast anyway, then flagged the site with GPS coordinates. That afternoon, I hiked back to Site 7 to pull the memory card early. When I arrived, the camera was missing. Not stolen, ripped clean off the tree. The mounting strap was still there, torn in half, with 4 parallel gouges in the bark above it. Each gouge was roughly 2 inches long, curved slightly. I found the camera 15 feet away, face down in the moss. The casing was cracked, but the card was intact. I should have left then. I had enough data to justify an early exit, and the permit didn't require me to stay the full term. But I also had something I couldn't explain, and 6 years in field biology had taught me that unexplained usually just means under-researched. I decided to stay another 72 hours, move camp closer to the river, and set up a new camera array with motion-activated infrared. The second night after moving camp, I woke to footsteps. Not animal footsteps, too measured, too deliberate. They circled my tent once, paused near the entrance, then moved toward the creek. I counted 12 steps before they faded. My heartbeat was loud enough that I almost missed the last sound. A single, sharp knock against a tree trunk, like someone striking it with a heavy branch. 3 seconds later, another knock answered from farther up the valley. When I checked the perimeter at first light, I found a stack. 7 stones, each roughly the size of a grapefruit, balanced on top of each other, near the trail leading west. They hadn't been there the night before. The top stone was still wet with dew, but the others were dry underneath, meaning they'd been placed after the temperature dropped, sometime after midnight. I didn't touch it. I photographed it, logged the coordinates, and started breaking down camp. Whatever I was documenting had started documenting me. I returned to base camp by mid-morning on the 22nd. The plan was simple: retrieve the backup battery packs, upload my data to the cloud via satellite link, and hike out to the ranger station by nightfall. I had roughly 9 miles of terrain between me and the trailhead, most of it downhill. With good pace, I'd be out by 16 Werser. The new camera I'd mounted near the creek was still running. I checked the feed remotely from my phone. The Wi-Fi repeater I'd set up had about 40 yards of range. The footage showed nothing unusual until 03:17 that morning. That's when a figure moved through frame, passing between 2 hemlocks on the far side of the creek. It was upright, broad across the shoulders, and moving with a gait that wasn't quite human. The stride was too long, the arm swing too pronounced. It paused mid-frame, turned its head toward the camera, then continued upstream and out of view. I rewound and played it again. The figure stood roughly 7.5 feet tall, maybe more. The body was covered in dark hair, matted and uneven. When it turned, I caught a glimpse of the face, flat, wide, with a pronounced brow. The eyes reflected the infrared light in a brief flash before it looked away. My hands were shaking when I downloaded the file. I had spent 6 years in wilderness research and never felt fear like that. Not from the footage itself, but from the certainty that I was no longer alone, and that whatever I was sharing this forest with had been aware of me long before I was aware of it. I should have packed up and left. Instead, I did something stupid. I followed it. The tracks were easy to find. They led upstream, staying close to the water, crossing onto a gravel bar about a 1/4 mile from camp. The prints were deeper here, clearer. I measured one at 19 inches, with a stride length that stretched to 62 inches in places where the terrain opened up. Whatever made these was moving fast, but not running. It was walking with purpose. I followed for an hour, keeping my distance, stopping every few minutes to listen. The forest had gone quiet again, that same dead silence I'd heard before. My GPS started glitching around the 1-mile mark, coordinates jumping, then freezing, then resetting to a default position somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. I switched to manual navigation, marking my route with small cairns every 100 yards. At 11:45, I found the tree break. A young alder, maybe 6 inches in diameter, had been snapped cleanly at 8 feet off the ground. The break was fresh, sap still running, bark peeled back in strips. The tree hadn't fallen. It had been twisted and bent downward, the top shoved into the ground to form an arch. Nearby, 3 more trees had been treated the same way, creating a rough corridor pointing deeper into the forest. This wasn't storm damage. This was construction. I took photos, measured the heights, checked for tool marks. There were none. The trees had been manipulated by hand, or something like hands. The strength required to snap an alder at that height would be immense, far beyond human capability, without equipment. I kept moving. The trail led up a ridgeline, gaining elevation quickly. My lungs burned in the thin air, and my pack felt heavier than it should have. At the top of the ridge, the forest opened into a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across. In the center was a structure. It was a teepee-shaped frame made from stripped branches, each one 8 to 10 feet long, lashed together at the top with vine and bark. Inside the frame, smaller sticks had been woven into a lattice, creating walls. The entrance faced east. Around the perimeter, stones had been arranged in a circle, each one placed deliberately, evenly spaced. I circled it twice, looking for signs of human construction. Cut marks, metal fasteners, rope. There were none. Everything had been gathered and assembled from the immediate area. The vines used for lashing were still green, meaning the structure was recent. Inside, the ground was packed flat and smooth. No debris, no scattered leaves. In the center was a single depression, maybe 2 feet across, filled with charcoal and ash. I knelt and touched it. Cold, but not old. It had been used within the last few days. That's when I heard the scream. It came from the north, maybe half a mile away, echoing through the trees. It wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I recognized. It started low, guttural, then rose into a shriek that rattled my chest. It lasted 4 seconds, then cut off abruptly. I stood frozen, listening. 30 seconds later, it came again, closer this time. And then I heard the response. Another scream, higher pitched, from the opposite direction. They were communicating. I had 2 choices: move deeper into the forest and try to observe from a distance, or retreat to camp and extract immediately. Every instinct told me to run. But I also knew that if I left now, I'd never prove what I'd seen. The footage could be dismissed as a costume, the tracks as a hoax, the structure as hunters playing games. I needed more. I decided to stay until dusk, set up one more camera overlooking the structure, and leave at first light. It was a compromise between caution and evidence. It was also a mistake. By 14, I had the camera mounted in a Douglas fir with a clear view of the clearing. I used a 30-foot climbing rope to get high enough that the camera wouldn't be easily spotted. The battery would last 72 hours, and the memory card could hold 6 days of footage. I synced it to my phone, checked the angle, and climbed down. As I coiled the rope, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by ferns, was a deer carcass. It was fresh, maybe a day old, gutted cleanly, with the hide peeled back and folded to one side. The internal organs were gone, but the meat was untouched. Flies hadn't found it yet. Something had killed it, processed it, and left it there. I took 3 steps toward it, then stopped. The silence had returned, thicker than before, and I realized I couldn't hear my own footsteps. The forest had swallowed every sound. That's when I saw the eyes. 30 yards to my left, just inside the tree line, something was watching me. I didn't turn my head. I kept my gaze forward, but shifted my vision to the periphery. The shape was massive, motionless, blending almost perfectly with the shadows. The only reason I saw it at all was because it blinked, and for half a second, the amber reflection of sunlight gave it away. We stayed like that for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 10 seconds. Then, slowly, it stepped back into the darkness and disappeared. I didn't run. I walked, steadily, back down the ridge the way I'd come, forcing myself not to look back. My heart was hammering, my mouth dry, but I kept my pace controlled. Running would have been a mistake. I knew that instinctively, the way prey animals know not to bolt until the predator commits. When I reached the base of the ridge, I allowed myself to breathe. I checked my phone. no signal, no GPS. I followed my cairns back toward camp, moving faster now, glancing behind me every few minutes. I made it back by 16:30. The sun was still up, but the shadows were long. I packed everything I could carry: food, water, first aid, the backup drive with my footage, and left the rest. My plan was to hike through the night and reach the trailhead by dawn. But when I looked at the trail leading east, back toward civilization, I saw it. A fresh line of trees, each one stripped and bent into an arch, forming a tunnel that stretched into the forest. The same design as before. It was blocking my exit. I stood at the edge of camp, staring at the tree tunnel for a full minute before my brain caught up. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Something had watched me prepare to leave, and then constructed a barrier across the only trail I knew well enough to navigate in fading light. I had 3 options: force my way through the tunnel, find an alternate route in unfamiliar terrain, or stay at camp and wait for daylight. The first option felt like a test I'd fail. The second could get me lost or injured. The third meant spending another night in territory I was clearly not welcome in. I chose the second option. Using my compass and the topographic map I'd printed before the expedition, I plotted a route that would take me northwest, skirting the ridge, then looping back toward the Forest Service road from a different angle. It added roughly 4 miles to the hike and would take me through denser forest, but it avoided the structure entirely. If I moved fast, I could cover the distance before full dark. I started at 17:10, keeping a steady pace, checking my compass every few minutes. The terrain was rougher than I expected. Thick underbrush, fallen logs, steep drainage cuts that forced me to backtrack. My phone was useless for navigation, the GPS still glitching, but the compass held steady. By 18:30, I'd covered maybe 2 miles. The light was fading fast, filtering through the canopy in narrow shafts. I stopped to drink water and check my bearings. That's when I noticed the markers. They were small, easy to miss. Stones stacked in 2s and 3s, always on my left side, spaced about 50 yards apart. I hadn't placed them. I backtracked to the first one I'd seen and examined it closely. The stones were balanced deliberately, the top stone smaller than the base, fitted into a natural depression. It was the same design I'd seen near my tent 2 days earlier. Someone, or something, was tracking me. I kept moving, faster now, ignoring the burn in my legs. The markers continued, always on my left, always just visible in the fading light. At 19 Uoka, they stopped. I checked my compass, confirmed I was still heading northwest, and pushed forward. 10 minutes later, I hit the gorge. It was a ravine, maybe 40 feet across, cutting straight through the forest like a scar. The bottom was hidden in shadow, but I could hear water running far below. The sides were nearly vertical, covered in loose shale and exposed roots. There was no way down without climbing gear, and no way around without adding hours to the hike. I stood at the edge, weighing my options. Behind me, the forest had gone silent again. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. The air had that same thick quality, like pressure building before a storm. Then I saw the bridge. It was 30 yards to my right, spanning the gorge at its narrowest point. It wasn't a human bridge. It was a fallen tree, a massive western red cedar that must have toppled decades ago. The trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, weathered smooth by time and rain. It stretched from one side of the ravine to the other, bark long gone, surface worn flat by age. I approached carefully, testing the wood with my weight. It held solid, no rot, no give. Crossing it would be dangerous, One slip and I'd fall 40 feet into rocks and freezing water, but it was the only option that didn't involve backtracking into whatever was following me. I took off my pack, clipped it to a carabiner on my belt, and started across. The tree was wide enough to walk upright if I went slow, but the drop on either side made every step feel like a tightrope. I focused on the far side, keeping my breathing steady, ignoring the vertigo clawing at my peripheral vision. Halfway across, I stopped. Something was carved into the wood beneath my feet. I knelt slowly, one hand braced against the trunk for balance, and looked closer. The markings were shallow, worn smooth by weather, but still visible, a series of lines and circles arranged in a pattern. 4 circles, connected by a single curved line, with smaller marks radiating outward like spokes. It looked intentional, deliberate, like a symbol or a map. I pulled out my phone and took a photo, even though I knew the image quality would be poor in the low light. Then I stood and kept moving, my pulse hammering in my ears. When I reached the far side, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The forest on this side of the gorge felt different, older, denser, quieter. The trees were larger, the canopy thicker, the undergrowth sparse. It reminded me of old growth sections I'd seen in Olympic, the kind of forest that hadn't been logged in over a century. I checked my compass again, adjusted my heading, and started walking. Within 5 minutes I found the camp. It wasn't a human camp. There were no tents, no fire rings, no trash, but it was unmistakably a site that had been used, maintained, and organized. In a small clearing, maybe 20 yards across, I saw 3 separate structures. One large teepee-style frame, identical to what I'd found on the ridge, and 2 smaller lean-tos built against fallen logs. Between them, the ground was packed flat and clear of debris. Around the perimeter, stones had been arranged in a pattern, not a circle this time, but a spiral, maybe 10 feet across, with the largest stones on the outer edge and the smallest at the center. I moved closer, every nerve screaming at me to turn back. Inside the largest structure, I found more. A pile of pine boughs, arranged like a bed, a stack of deer bones cleaned and sorted by size, and a row of objects that stopped me cold. They were tools, crude but functional. A flat stone with a sharpened edge, bound to a wooden handle with sinew. A length of antler, polished smooth, with a point at one end. 3 round stones, each the size of a baseball, with grooves worn into their surfaces where they'd been gripped repeatedly. And at the far end, a stick roughly 4 feet long, stripped of bark, with symbols carved into its length. I photographed everything. My hands were shaking, but I forced them steady, capturing angles, details, scale. This wasn't a hoax. This was proof of tool use, of planning, of culture. Then I made the mistake of touching one. I picked up the carved stick, turning it in my hands to see the markings more clearly. They were similar to what I'd seen on the bridge. Circles, lines, shapes that almost looked like writing. As I examined it, I heard a sound behind me. It was a low growl, deep and resonant, coming from just outside the structure. I froze, the stick still in my hands, my breath caught in my throat. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with cold certainty that I had crossed a line I didn't know existed. I set the stick down carefully, exactly where I'd found it, and backed out of the structure. The growl stopped. I took 3 slow steps toward the edge of the clearing, my eyes scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them. Not 1, but 3. They were standing in the shadows between the trees, motionless, watching me. The largest was in the center, maybe 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that hung past its knees. The other two were smaller, flanking it on either side. They didn't move, didn't vocalize. They just watched. I understood then what the markers had been. They weren't tracking me. They were herding me. Every stone stack, every tree structure, every blocked path had been guiding me here, to this place where they wanted me. The question was, why? I stood perfectly still, trying to slow my breathing, trying to project calm. The largest figure tilted its head slightly, a gesture so human it sent a chill down my spine. Then it raised one arm and pointed, not at me, but past me, toward the far side of the clearing. I turned slowly, following the direction of its gesture. There, partially hidden by ferns, was a backpack. It was old, the fabric faded and torn, covered in moss and dirt. Next to it, half buried in the soil, was a boot. Someone else had been here. Someone who hadn't left. When I turned back, the three figures were gone. Forrest was still silent, but the pressure had lifted, replaced by something else. A clear message. I had been allowed to see this. I had been allowed to leave. But if I came back, if I crossed this boundary again, the outcome would be different. I didn't run, but I didn't stop moving either. I walked to the far edge of the clearing, found a game trail heading northwest, and followed it at a steady pace. Behind me, I heard a single knock, wood on wood, sharp and clear. It was answered by two more, farther away, forming a triangle of sound around my position. They were escorting me out. I walked for 2 hours in near darkness, using my headlamp only when I had to, following the trail by feel and memory. The knocking continued, always behind me, always maintaining distance, always keeping me on course. When I finally hit the Forest Service road at 2140, the sound stopped. I made it to the ranger station by midnight. The ranger on duty took one look at me and asked if I needed medical attention. I told him I'd gotten lost and needed to report some unusual findings. He said he'd file a report in the morning. I didn't tell him about the camp. I didn't tell him about the tools. I didn't tell him about the boot. Some borders, I realized, aren't meant to be documented. They're meant to be respected. I spent 3 days at a motel in Forks, reviewing the footage frame by frame, trying to convince myself I'd seen what I thought I'd seen. The photos were clear enough, the structures, the tools, the carved symbols. But the figure from the infrared camera was harder to explain. In still frames, it looked almost plausible as a person in a costume, until you analyzed the movement, the stride length, the way the joints articulated. No human moves like that. On the 4th day, I drove back to the ranger station. I needed to file a formal report, something that would put the location on record, even if I kept the details vague. The same ranger from before was on duty, a man named Garrett, who'd worked the Olympic National Forest for 15 years. I told him I'd found an abandoned camp with unusual structures and possible evidence of someone living off-grid. I didn't mention the tools or the figures or the boot. He listened, took notes, and told me the area I'd described was known for transient activity. Hikers who went off permit, sometimes people avoiding the law. He said they'd send a patrol to check it out within the week. I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had been there would be gone by the time they arrived. That should have been the end of it. I had my data, my photos, my footage. I could write it up as an unexplained encounter, submit it to a journal, and let other researchers decide what to make of it. But I couldn't stop thinking about the boot. Someone had gone into that forest and hadn't come out, and instead of reporting it properly, I'd walked away. On September 29th, I went back. I didn't tell anyone. I packed, light, just a day bag with water, first aid, my camera, and a handheld GPS unit that I'd tested a dozen times to make sure it wouldn't glitch. I entered from a different trailhead, approaching the gorge from the south, and reached the cedar bridge by 10:04. The carvings were still there, weathered but visible. I took better photos this time, using a scale card and different angles to capture the depth and spacing of the marks. Then I crossed, moving carefully, my eyes scanning the far tree line. The camp was empty. The structures were intact, but the tools were gone. The stone spiral had been disturbed, the outer ring scattered, as if something large had walked through it deliberately. I searched for the backpack and boot. They were gone too. The ground where they'd been resting smoothed over and covered with fresh pine needles. I felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. Relief that I wouldn't have to confront what the boot implied. Disappointment that the evidence I'd hoped to document had vanished. I was about to leave when I noticed the tree. It was a hemlock at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards from the largest structure, and carved into its bark at eye level was a symbol, the same 4 circles connected by a curved line I'd seen on the bridge. Below it, carved more deeply, was something new, a handprint. Not a bare paw, not a claw mark, a handprint. 5 fingers, a palm, a thumb. It was larger than mine by half, but the proportions were unmistakably humanoid. I placed my own hand next to it for comparison and took a photo. The print was fresh, the sap still sticky, carved within the last day or 2. It was a message, and the meaning felt clear. I see you. I know you came back. That's when I heard the breathing. It came from behind me, low and steady, the sound of something large drawing air through its nose. I turned slowly, keeping my movements small, non-threatening. 20 feet away, standing at the edge of the tree line, was the figure I'd seen in the infrared footage. In daylight, it was impossible to dismiss. It stood upright, easily 7.5 feet tall, with a barrel chest and arms that hung long and powerful. The body was covered in dark brown hair, coarse and uneven, with patches of lighter fur across the chest and shoulders. The face was flat, with a heavy brow, a broad nose, and eyes that were unmistakably intelligent, amber, focused, and watching me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. We stood like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. I didn't raise my camera. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then it did something I didn't expect. It knelt. The gesture was slow, deliberate, lowering itself until we were closer to eye level. It extended one arm and placed its hand flat on the ground between us, palm down. Then it lifted the hand and gestured toward me, not aggressively, but with a clear invitation. It wanted me to do the same. I understood what it was asking. This wasn't a threat display, it was a test of intent. I knelt, my legs shaking, and placed my hand flat on the ground. The creature watched, its head tilting slightly, and then it made a sound, a low rumble, almost like a purr, resonant and calm. It stood, took 2 steps backward, and gestured toward the structure behind me. I didn't move. My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. This was communication. It wanted to show me something. The creature waited, patient, then gestured again, more insistently this time. I stood slowly and walked toward the structure, glancing back every few steps. It followed at a distance, maintaining space but clearly guiding me. Inside the structure, arranged in the center where the tools had been, was a bundle. It was wrapped in bark and bound with vine, roughly the size of a shoebox. The creature stopped outside the entrance, watching, and made another sound, a short huff, like punctuation. I knelt and carefully unwrapped the bundle. Inside were bones, human bones, a jawbone, part of a skull, vertebrae, and a femur. They were old, weathered, with teeth marks along the edges. Next to the bones was a laminated card, faded and torn. It was a driver's license. The name was partially legible. Michael Ventura, DOB 0817 Unasto 1979. I sat back on my heels, staring at the remains. This was the person who'd left the boot, the person who hadn't made it out. The creature stepped into the entrance, blocking the light. I looked up at it, and for the first time, I saw something in its eyes that I recognized, grief, or something close to it. It reached down, picked up the jawbone, and held it gently, turning it in its hands. Then it placed it back in the bundle and looked at me. The message was clear. This is what happens when you don't respect the boundary. This is what I have been trying to prevent. It gestured toward the bundle, then toward me, then back toward the direction of the trail. It wanted me to take the remains. It wanted me to bring this person home. I wrapped the bones carefully, secured the bundle in my pack, and stood. The creature stepped aside, watching as I left the structure. I walked to the edge of the clearing, turned back once, and saw it standing there, motionless, silhouetted against the trees. I raised one hand, a gesture of acknowledgement, maybe thanks. It raised its own hand in return, then turned and disappeared into the forest. I made it back to the trailhead by early afternoon. At the ranger station, I handed over the remains and told Garrett I'd found them near Boulder Creek. He asked how I'd found them. I said I'd been hiking and saw something that didn't look right. The remains were identified 2 weeks later as Michael Ventura, a solo hiker reported missing in August 2019. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and traumatic injury, likely from a fall. The case was closed. I never mentioned the creature. I never filed the report I'd planned to write, because I realized, standing in that clearing, that I hadn't been studying an animal. I'd been trespassing on something older, something that had its own rules, its own morality. It hadn't hunted Ventura. It had tried to warn him, the same way it had warned me. And when warning failed, it had done the only thing it could, protected its territory. Some discoveries aren't meant to be shared. They're meant to change the person who makes them. I should have stopped. I'd returned the remains, filed the report, and walked away with something most researchers never get: confirmation. But confirmation isn't the same as understanding, and for 3 weeks after leaving Olympic, I couldn't stop thinking about the symbols, the carved circles, the patterns in the stone spirals, the handprint on the tree. They weren't random. They meant something, and I needed to know what. On October 18th, I drove back to Forks with a different plan. This time I wasn't going to the camp. I was going to consult with someone who might actually understand what I'd found, a linguistics professor at University of Washington, who specialized in indigenous petroglyphs and Pacific Northwest symbolic systems. I'd sent her photos of the carvings, and she'd agreed to meet me in person to examine the originals. Her name was Dr. Sarah Kwan. She arrived in Forks on the 19th, and we drove to the trailhead together that afternoon. I'd planned a route that would take us to the Cedar Bridge, but no farther, just close enough to document the carvings, then out before dark. We reached the bridge by 15:30. Dr. Kwan spent 20 minutes examining the symbols, taking measurements, comparing them to reference photos she'd brought. She confirmed what I'd suspected. The patterns weren't random, and they weren't modern. They resembled Salish carvings found on the coast, but older, more abstract. She said the spacing and depth suggested they'd been made with stone tools, not metal, and the weathering indicated they were at least several decades old, possibly much older. While she worked, I kept watch, scanning the tree line. The forest was quiet, but not silent. Birds called from the canopy. A breeze moved through the branches. It felt normal, neutral. I allowed myself to relax. That was my first mistake. My second mistake was agreeing when Dr. Kwan asked to see the camp. She'd listened to my description of the structures, the tools, the deliberate organization, and said it could be the most significant ethnographic finding in the region in 50 years. She wanted to document it properly, with scale measurements and soil samples. She said we'd be in and out in an hour, well before sunset. I knew I shouldn't. I'd been given a clear boundary, a warning, and I'd respected it. But Dr. Kwan was a professional, and this was her field of expertise. Having her validation would mean everything. We crossed the bridge at 1610 and followed the game trail to the clearing. As we approached, I felt the air shift, that same thick pressure I'd felt before, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I stopped, raising one hand to signal caution. "Something wrong?" Dr. Kwan asked. "Just give me a second," I said, listening. The forest was silent now, completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. I'd walked into this trap before, and I knew what it meant. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." Dr. Kwan frowned, looking past me toward the clearing. "We just got here. Let me at least—" That's when the warning came, a deep, guttural roar that shook the air, so loud it felt like a physical force. It came from the clearing ahead, followed immediately by another from behind us, cutting off our retreat. Dr. Kwan's face went white. "What the hell was that?" "Run," I said. "Stay with me and run." I grabbed her arm and pulled her off the trail, crashing through underbrush toward the north. The plan was to circle wide, avoid the clearing entirely, and hit the service road from a different angle. It would add miles, but it was the only option that didn't involve going back through whatever had just surrounded us. Behind us, I heard branches snapping, heavy footfalls moving fast. Not one set, multiple. They were coordinating, flanking us, driving us away from the trail. We ran for 10 minutes straight, adrenaline drowning out the burn in my legs. Dr. Kwan kept pace, her breathing ragged but controlled. When we hit a steep embankment, I helped her down, half sliding through loose dirt and rocks. At the bottom was a creek, maybe 8 feet across, running fast with snowmelt. "Cross it," I said. "Stay in the water as long as you can." We waded downstream, the cold soaking through my boots, numbing my feet. Behind us, the sounds stopped at the creek's edge. I risked a glance back and saw movement in the trees. Shapes, 3 or 4 of them, standing motionless, watching. They weren't crossing. Just like before, they wouldn't cross running water. We kept moving until the creek widened into a shallow pool, then climbed out on the far side and continued north. My GPS was glitching again, but I had the compass, and I knew that if we kept heading north-northwest, we'd eventually hit the service road. The sun was dropping fast, shadows lengthening into darkness. Dr. Kwan stumbled, catching herself against a tree. "I need to stop," she gasped. "Not yet." Another mile. "I can't." That's when we heard it. A sound that didn't belong in any forest, in any wilderness, in any natural place. It was a voice, human-sounding but wrong, mimicking speech without words, repeating a pattern of syllables that rose and fell like a question. It came from ahead of us, blocking our path. "What is that?" Dr. Kwan whispered. "Keep moving, don't respond." The voice came again, closer, insistent. Then it changed, shifting into something that sounded almost like laughter, low, rhythmic, mocking. I realized what was happening. They weren't chasing us. They were herding us again, pushing us toward something. and this time I didn't think it was a camp. "Change direction," I said. "East, now." We veered sharply, scrambling uphill through thick brush. The laughter followed, always just out of sight, always maintaining distance. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept moving, dragging Dr. Kwan with me. At the top of the rise, I saw lights. Distant, yellow, artificial. The service road. "There!" I shouted. "Go!" We half ran, half fell down the far slope, branches tearing at our clothes, rocks sliding under our feet. The laughter grew louder, multiple voices now, overlapping, surrounding us. But they weren't getting closer. They were saying goodbye. We hit the road at 1940, collapsing onto the gravel, gasping for air. Behind us the forest went silent. No voices, no movement, no sound. Just the faint hum of distant traffic and the wind through the trees. Dr. Kwan looked at me, her face pale, eyes wide. "What the hell did you take me into?" I didn't have an answer. Not one she'd believe. We walked 2 miles along the road before a Park Service truck picked us up. The ranger asked if we were okay, if we needed medical attention. We said we'd gotten turned around and lost the trail. He didn't push for details. Dr. Kwan left the next morning without saying goodbye. 2 days later, I received an email from her. It was brief. "I won't be publishing anything about what we found. I suggest you do the same. Some doors should stay closed." I deleted her email and every photo I'd taken of the symbols, the footage from the camera, the plaster casts of the footprints, the recordings. All of it went into a box in my storage unit, where it's stayed ever since. Because I finally understood what I'd been too arrogant to see before. This wasn't a discovery, it was a warning, and the only reason I was still alive to tell it was because I'd been given chances that Michael Ventura never got. The forest belongs to them. It always has. And every time I'd gone back, I'd been gambling that their patience would hold. On October 21st, their patience ran out. I haven't been back to Olympic National Forest. It's been over a year now, and I don't plan to return. My work has shifted east. I took a research position studying white-tailed deer in the Adirondacks, terrain that feels safer, more predictable, less likely to push back. People ask me sometimes why I left the Northwest. I tell them I needed a change of scenery. It's not entirely a lie. The nightmares lasted 3 months, always the same sequence. I'm back in the clearing, the structures surrounding me, and the figures emerge from the trees. But instead of watching, they move closer, circling, closing the distance until I can see every detail, the texture of their hair, the intelligence in their eyes, the controlled deliberation of their movements. I wake up before they reach me, heart racing, sheets soaked with sweat. The dreams have mostly stopped now, but I still hear the laughter sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet. I know it's not real, but knowing doesn't make it easier. Dr. Kwan kept her word. She never published anything about the symbols, never spoke publicly about what we found. I saw her once at a conference in Seattle, 8 months after Olympic. She looked at me across the room, gave a small nod, and turned away. We never spoke. There was nothing left to say. The remains of Michael Ventura were returned to his family in California. I attended the memorial service, though I sat in the back and left before anyone could ask me questions. His sister gave a eulogy, talking about how much he loved the wilderness, how he'd always felt more at home in the mountains than in cities. She said he died doing what he loved. I didn't correct her. Sometimes I think about that moment in the clearing when the creature placed the bones in my hands. I've replayed it 1,000 times, trying to understand what it meant. Was it a warning? an offering, a plea. I think it was all of those things, and something more, an acknowledgement that we share the same world, even if we occupy different parts of it. It knew I could take those bones back to people who would mourn them. It knew I was the bridge between its world and mine. That's what haunts me most. Not the fear, not the danger, but the responsibility. I was given a choice that Michael Ventura never got, and I don't fully understand why. The box in my storage unit remains sealed. Every few months, I think about opening it, reviewing the footage, trying to make sense of what I documented. But I never do, because I know what I'd find. Evidence of something extraordinary, something that would change the way we understand the natural world, something that would bring researchers and cameras and helicopters into a place that has remained hidden for a reason. I think about the handprint on the tree, the deliberate marking carved fresh just before I arrived. It wasn't a threat. It was communication. I see you. I know you're here. This is the line. In my field, we're trained to observe, document, and publish. The scientific method demands transparency, repeatability, proof. But science also requires context, and the context of Olympic was clear. I was the intruder, not the subject. I was the one who needed to be studied, measured, tested. And when I failed the test, I was removed. I've thought about going public, writing an anonymous account, submitting the footage to a cryptozoology site where it could circulate without my name attached. But every time I consider it, I remember the clearing, the bones, the grief in those amber eyes. I remember the boundary I crossed and the mercy I was shown when I could have easily ended up like Ventura. Some knowledge isn't meant to be shared. Some discoveries are meant to change only the person who makes them. I still do field research, still spend weeks alone in remote wilderness, still set camera traps and track animal movements. But I'm different now. I pay attention to the signs I used to ignore, the patterns in broken branches, the arrangements of stones, the moments when the forest goes silent. I've learned to recognize boundaries, even invisible ones, and I've learned that crossing them always has a cost. Last month, I was setting up a new study site in the Adirondacks, maybe 15 miles from the nearest town. I found a stone stack near my campsite, 3 rocks, balanced carefully, clearly deliberate. My first instinct was to document it, analyze it, try to understand who placed it and why. Instead, I packed up and moved my camp 2 miles west. When I returned 3 days later to collect a camera I'd left behind, the stone stack was gone. I don't know if it was them. I don't know if they exist outside Olympic, if they have territories elsewhere, if they've been watching me in the years since I left. But I've stopped assuming I'm alone in the wilderness. I've stopped assuming I'm at the top of the hierarchy. And I've started to understand that the world is older, stranger, and more carefully balanced than I ever imagined. The silence that fell over the forest that night, the silence that preceded every encounter, wasn't empty. It was full of attention, full of intelligence, full of judgment. It was the sound of something ancient deciding whether I deserved to continue walking through its world. I was allowed to leave. Not everyone is. Sometimes, late at night, I pull up a map of Olympic National Forest on my laptop and trace the route I took from Boulder Creek to the Cedar Bridge. I zoom in on the clearing, though there's nothing visible from satellite imagery, just trees and shadows. I wonder if the structures are still there, if new ones have been built, if the symbols have been carved elsewhere as warnings for others like me who wander too far from the trails. I wonder if they remember me the way I remember them. And I wonder, sometimes, if the line they drew wasn't just a boundary in space, but a boundary in understanding, a line between knowing and accepting, between documenting and respecting, between discovery and silence. I chose silence, not because I'm afraid, though I am, not because I lack evidence, though I've destroyed most of it, but because I finally understood what I was too arrogant to see in the beginning. I was never hunting anything. I was being evaluated. And the fact that I'm here, alive, able to write this, means I passed. Barely. The world is full of borders we can't see. Some are protected by law, some by geography, some by something older than either. I crossed one, and I was shown the cost of crossing it. I was given a warning, then a second chance, then a final expulsion. I won't get a fourth. The forest will always be there, waiting, watching, maintaining the balance it's held for longer than we've had language to describe it. And somewhere in the shadows between the trees, they continue their lives, raising their young, marking their territory, burying their dead, and remembering the humans who wander too close. I hope they remember me as someone who learned, someone who listened, someone who understood, in the end, that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be respected.